Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. 5 months ago, what has become known as the Iran deal officially went into effect when the United Nations International Atomic Energy Commission verified that Iran had met the agreement's initial early stages of starting to decommission its nuclear power plants and other nuclear research facilities. Where are we 5 months after this very historic agreement? Are there people in Washington who still want to undermine it? The answer is yes. But what are the greater effects in the broader Middle East, and most especially on the long-term tensions, diplomatic tensions between the United States and Iran? That's what we're going to take a look at on this month's Other Voices, and I'm very pleased to have returning to Other Voices to help us understand this distinguished journalist, REESE Erlich. REESE, welcome back.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Your last appearance here is one of our highest rated on YouTube. I'll just mention that. Most views.
Are we up for a YouTube Emmy or something?
We are up for the Public Access Community Media Award.
If you get it, I want a copy to put on my mantle.
This happened after you were last here, but the 6 Western states, that division of the Alliance for Community Media, selected this program as Best Informational Talk Show.
Congratulations.
For its 2016 award, and we are now on to the national awards, which will be announced in August, so I'll let you know.
Okay.
Let me finish introducing you, because in addition to your long career as an award-winning journalist, I do want to mention 2 related things. REESE was awarded a grant from the Pulitzer Center for crisis reporting for his Iran coverage, and he's also the author of The Iran Agenda, The Real Story of U.S. Policy and the Middle East Crisis, which is still available in bookstores, even though it's a few years old now.
And available at embarrassingly low prices as a used book on Amazon.
And how are your ratings on Amazon?
Oh, they're great. It's just the prices aren't very good. You pour your whole life into writing a book, and it's for sale for 87 cents. You know, it doesn't do a lot for the
ego. Yeah, and then add that to what we're paying you for tonight.
Yes, on the other hand, yeah, right. Watch out for the shipping charges, though.
When was the last time you were in Iran?
February of this year.
Uh-huh. Tell us a little bit about the trip.
Well, I went to cover the elections. They were having parliamentary elections mainly, and the results were very positive for the centrist President Rouhani and for his allies, including reformists. They won all the seats in the parliamentary seats for the city of Tehran and quite a few of the other major cities. When all the elections were finished, they had a round of runoffs and so on. The reformists and their allies had a significant number, but not a working majority. So there's going to be ongoing battles with the very hardline conservative forces who don't want to see any openings to the West, opposed the nuclear agreement and so on. But there's a real dynamism and a sense of hope in Iran that I hadn't seen under the Ahmadinejad years.
A lot of people, I think, don't know even how politics in the parliament works in Iran. Why don't we take a minute to run down that? It's a proportional representation, and
yeah, it's a unique system in the world because it's both. It has elements of Western parliamentary system and an overlay of Islamic jurisprudence and supposed guidance. So the easiest part to understand is a parliament. It's elected every 4 years. Everybody's out. Everyone's up for re-election or out of office and either can run again or not. They don't have political parties. They have kind of alliances and groupings. So it's kind of hard to figure out who stands where, and people are constantly shifting their alliances. The recent elections appear to be honest, based on the results and the interviews that I did. Of course, there were the famous 2009 elections for president, which were highly disputed.
Yeah. Are there international observers? Do they allow observers
Not
in?
to my knowledge, no.
Yeah.
But we don't have them in the U.S. either, right?
No, we don't.
When the Iranians can come observe our elections, then they'll probably let us send theirs.
In fact, you're probably aware that Jimmy Carter's Carter Center said that the way elections are run in the United States, we wouldn't even qualify, have the minimum qualifications for the Carter Center to send observers.
I absolutely believe that. We live in the greatest democracy in the world, except when it isn't. All right, so back to Iran. So you have, on the one hand, you have this kind of parliamentary system, and they have local city councils and mayors and so that are elected. But then they have the supreme leader, who was originally Ayatollah Khomeini and now is Ayatollah Khamenei, who has veto power over everything. He can change decisions made by the president, by the parliament. He can rule by decree if he wants, and he holds a position for life. In addition to that, there are a number of conservative political institutions that vet the candidates, for example. The Revolutionary Guards and the intelligence services have tremendous amount of power. The judiciary acts as a basically separate power unto itself. You probably heard of the Americans and others who've gotten arrested, or Americans of Iranian descent, who've gotten arrested, or the 3 hikers.
Yeah.
The judiciary just rejected all pleas, even from the president, to free them, and free them when they felt like it. So it's certainly not a democracy, but it's under the guise of being guided by Islam. They have a new kind of dictatorship that allows elections.
What kind of turnout do they get in the elections?
Pretty high, 70, 80%. And you get your national ID stamped when you vote. So there's people take the election, even though the elections take place within very narrow confines, people take them seriously.
Good. All right. Well, thanks for that background on that. Let's get back to the topic of the night, or get to it finally, the Iran agreement, what's been known as the Iran deal. Let's just catch people up with a short history of what the deal is, what it entails, and
sure. Well, of course,
how we got there.
The irony of the deal is that it was a really hotly contested agreement for a non-existent problem. Iran doesn't have, and did not have a nuclear weapon.
Right.
Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program.
Right.
Iran had a program for nuclear power, and they were planning to generate nuclear fuel for a power program. And the U.S. managed, and others managed, to blow that up into a thing. Oh my God, the Iranians are going to have nuclear weapons. They're going to nuke Israel. They're going to nuke the U.S. Bases in the region, et cetera, et cetera. And probably most people in the United States, and perhaps in some other countries in Europe, really believed that Iran posed some kind of a nuclear threat, nuclear bomb threat. It didn't. And that, you don't have to take my word for it. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which had inspectors and continues to have inspectors in Iran, never said Iran had a nuclear bomb nor a nuclear program, certainly not in any recent time period. Nevertheless, the Iranians were feeling pressure from the sanctions, which were quite steep, that imposed by the U.S. and agreed to later by Europeans and others. And they went into negotiations with the U.S. And basically, the Iranians agreed to allow very intrusive inspections from the time the uranium is mined in a mine, to the time that it's processed, to the time its waste is disposed of by shipping it to Russia. And there's international inspectors at every stage of the process to guarantee that Iran is not diverting some of the fuel to build a bomb. Now, in return, the U.S. and the Europeans agreed to lift the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran for this non-existent nuclear weapons program.
I think it's important to mention, by the way, that the nuclear program they had was all perfectly legal under the non-proliferation
treaty. Exactly. They were members of the non-proliferation treaty. They followed the steps that they were supposed to. There were all kinds of issues that the IAEA raised a lot under pressure from the U.S. about what may have happened in the past. What about this particular nuclear reactor? But when the agreement was implemented, all of those issues were cleared away. So the U.S. what the U.S. was doing with Iran was the same thing it had done with Iraq about weapons of mass destruction. Oh, the Iraqis have some nuclear weapons hidden away somewhere that we can't find, maybe in Saddam Hussein's palace. We have to go inspect there, right? They just made stuff up. Same thing with Iran. They took anything that might look suspicious, that somebody might have done, an alleged laptop computer that was full of secrets, but nobody ever saw the laptop. And they convinced people that Iran had a nuclear program and that was going to use them, particularly against Israel. There was actually never any proof of that to happen. So back to the agreement. So the Iranians agreed to, okay, fine, we'll allow you to prove that there's no nuclear weapons program. The U.S., Europeans were going to lift the sanctions. That was the agreement.
And before we get to the current state of sanctions and what they're doing with the money, what was the effect of these sanctions? The sanctions were on export items, on their access to the international banking.
Yes.
They were pretty extensive.
Yeah, these were the most intrusive sanctions ever imposed any time in world history.
Even more so than what had been on Iraq.
Yeah, even more so. And because it was all of those things you mentioned. Iran couldn't sell its oil, or had limited ability to sell its oil. They couldn't import parts for airplanes, so they had constantly having crashing airplanes, old Boeings and other planes that were 30, 40 years old. They couldn't get parts, they would crash. Supposedly medicines and food were exempted, but in reality I did an extensive story about this, where the pharmaceutical companies, fearing U.S. pressure, basically cut off drug supplies. Food companies refused to ship food.
Even though they weren't banned
yeah, because what happened was that the U.S. had created this atmosphere that any dealings with Iran could get you in trouble and the U.S. might come after you. And so people, rather than deal with what was a relatively small market for them, they just cut it off completely.
Wow.
And the most intrusive and hard-hitting of all the sanctions were the banking sanctions. All international banking agreements, when two banks have to exchange money, goes through what's called the SWIFT system. It's a European-based clearinghouse, basically.
Yeah.
And the U.S. used that to say Iran couldn't use it. So literally, when you would deposit your money, say, to buy some spare parts in Europe, you would normally transfer that money to another bank in Europe, and then the part supplier would get the funds, and then they'd ship. Well, they couldn't do that anymore because the SWIFT froze out of Iran. So they were reduced to carrying bagfuls of currency to Dubai and secretly depositing it in a bank or a money operation, and then you could buy your parts, and then you'd have to kind of reverse the process to get paid for stuff. So it was very difficult, and I guess if you're sitting in Washington, very effective, because it did put a lot of pressure on the Iranians. It had the impact on ordinary Iranians of causing a lot of hardship in terms of medicines, food, medical equipment, and various other things.
And did it cause inflation or economic dislocation?
There's debates about that. Some people in Iran argued, yes, the sanctions drove up prices because you had to pay more to get these foreign products, and it caused inflation. Other people argue the Iranian government itself was imposing or pursuing inflationary policies, and that it was the Ahmadinejad government's fault. It was probably a combination of the two. And that was one of the things that made, by the end of his term, Ahmadinejad, who's known here mostly for being a blustering dictator, anti-gay, anti-Jewish, et cetera, in Iran, he's known as the guy who brought in 40% inflation at one point.
Yeah.
And he was really unpopular, and unemployment that hit 15–20% at one point. So his economic policies are what did him in Iran.
Yeah, not the bluster.
Nope.
Before we get to the current state of sanctions or the lifting of the sanctions, one other element that I think people need to understand about this international banking system is that during this period, just like any oil-producing country participating in the global oil market, Iran had billions and billions of dollars of its cash deposited in banks in Europe and the United States and China and elsewhere. And all those assets were frozen. They couldn't even get to their cash.
Right, and that was a serious problem for them. This is oil that had been sold, and normally they would, and even the oil companies like Shell, for example, wanted to send them the money, and they couldn't under the terms of the sanctions. And even China, which generally has not gone along with U.S. policies on this, they kept the Iranian money as well, and now is going to be used to have China come in and build infrastructure projects in Iran. And so the idea that somehow the U.S. was giving money to Iran, or that all this money would be used to sponsor terrorism, $150 billion to sponsor terrorism, that was just hokum invented particularly by the right wing in the United States. First of all, it was Iran's money to begin with.
Right.
We're not giving them anything.
Yeah.
All they were doing is getting their own money back.
The implication was somehow we were paying them. We're giving them 150.
Yeah, which was,
that's why I wanted to bring this up. It was their money. It's just been frozen in our banks.
And it hasn't gone for terrorism. When I was there, the government said that they had repatriated about $75 billion. Kerry, at one point, Secretary of State Kerry, said only $3 billion, I believe, he claimed had been repatriated. But anyway, whatever amount is, it's going to buy products and otherwise improve the Iranian economy. Whatever money had gone for Hezbollah to aid Shia militias in Iraq and other military adventures that support Assad, that money was already being spent anyway. It's not like they had a sudden boom of new money that money was going to be spent on those military adventures in any case.
Yeah. So the net effect of the lifting of the sanctions and unfreezing this money, far from giving Iran its own $150 billion, they've withdrawn part of it, and they're putting it into their domestic economy that had been damaged by the sanctions all these years.
And they have plenty of problems with their domestic economy, for sure. And getting the money back will help, but it's not going to solve it. They need to make some serious changes.
They have some structural
internally,
issues.
they have some very serious problems.
Yeah, especially if Ahmadinejad drove up inflation 40%. You say.
It has come down since then,
Before I leave the question of sanctions, some of these sanctions were put on by, I believe I have this right, by executive order by either George Bush or
previous
Barack.
presidents.
Yeah.
It goes all the way back to Carter.
But weren't there also some sanctions imposed by Congress? And are those covered in this agreement?
The sanctions that the U.S. still has are a complete mess. I've talked to lawyers who are experts, who've studied all the laws. It's not clear anybody can unwind all of the sanctions, because starting with Carter and basically imposed by every other president since then, whenever you got mad at Iran for something, they'd impose new sanctions.
Yeah.
There was the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. There was a whole series of sanctions over human rights. So the only sanctions that are officially lifted under the nuclear deal are those that were imposed against Iran for having a nuclear weapons program, alleged. That's the sanctions that have been lifted. But all the other sanctions under the Libya-Iran Sanctions Act, which was passed by Congress, the sanctions for human rights violations, et cetera, those are all still in place. Wow. All of them, virtually all of them, are unilateral. The Europeans never went along with those sanctions. The U.S. imposed them by itself, and those continue. But the U.S. has a lot of clout in the world.
Right.
And just as one example, the U.S. sanctions prohibit Iran from trading in U.S. dollars. So you'd think, okay, well, Iran can't go to the United States and use dollars to buy products here or something like that. But it's a lot more complicated than that, because it turns out when Iran, which its currency is a rial, goes to India, whose currency is a rupee, in order to change one into the other, first it's got to be changed into dollars. And then, so it goes from rupees to dollars to reals. They can't do it because that's trading in US dollars. So there's all
and that's
these
still on.
Yeah, those sanctions are still there. So it's making it incredibly, so all these banks have to kind of find workarounds or hope the US doesn't notice or various things, because technically they're not allowed to trade in US dollars.
And the euro can't fill in that gap?
Nope, you got to change it into dollars, into euros, into reals, yeah, in many cases.
All right, jeez.
And that, folks, is International Economics 101.
Yeah, and there is no hope that the Congress, as it's currently constituted, is going to change any of those other long...
One would think that's slim chance, to say the least.
So, keeping with the U.S. and Iran relations for right now, the international banking sanctions are off. Iran can move money around again, even though it can't be in dollars and that sort of thing. And with this new freedom in the international monetary system, is there new outside investment coming into Iran, as you might expect? It's had, it's a huge oil industry that's been totally neglected for a long time.
Yeah, Iran has signed agreements with a bunch of European companies in Italy, Germany, France, including car manufacturers, Airbus, the airplane companies. They have agreements in principle to either have direct investments or buy their products. They've even had this with Boeing. Just very recently, they've agreed to buy 100 Boeing passenger jets. But the deals haven't been inked. They're not actually being implemented yet. And that has to do with partially how all this stuff is going to be financed, and partially because of these continued sanctions that were supposed to have gone away. So they're on their way. The one area that seems to have actually Iran has made some progress is they're now shipping more oil. And those oil tankers are making deliveries, and their production, according to the Iranian government, has gone from about 1 million barrels a day to 3 million barrels a day. So that's a lot of oil, and presumably they have ways of getting paid for that.
So are U.S. companies, you mentioned Boeing, but it's not a done deal, are U.S. companies going in?
In general, other than Boeing, none that I know of.
And why is that?
Well, partly because they're prohibited under U.S. sanctions.
Other sanctions that haven't come on.
Right, other sanctions unrelated to the nuclear issue. And there are some, I've been doing a lot of speaking back in Washington, and we're always accused of preaching to the choir. Well, I've been preaching to people who've never been to church, businessmen, these Wild West entrepreneurs who want to invest in Iran, and if they've got something worthwhile and the Iranians want to do it, why not? But the minute they find out all these existing sanctions, the first thing they have to do is hire a bunch of lawyers who can comb through all this stuff to figure out if they can even do the trade, do the deals.
Yeah, 40 years of sanctions,
yeah,
as you mentioned, every president.
Yeah, there are American companies who want to do business there, but so far, other than Boeing, there's none that I know of, certainly no significant ones.
And Europe and China, are they taking up all the
now, China,
available oxygen? And
well, during the sanctions time, China and Russia, but particularly China, did a lot of trade with Iran. So a lot of consumer goods, for example, that had been coming from Europe are now coming from China. The Huawei phones, you can buy them for about $50-$60 in Iran now. A smuggled iPhone, can I talk about the iPhone? Being in Palo Alto, yeah. The iPhone is...
We've already done a program on the iPhone.
All right. It's like $600-700 for a smuggled iPhone. And so the Huawei is probably not as good a phone, but at that price difference, which one would you buy, and which one could you afford to buy? And that's simply one example. You see Chinese cars, et cetera. So
so that's an example of what you're talking about. Apple still can't sell iPhones in Iran
not
because
legally.
of these other...
You can find them all over the place, but they're
sure you can, yeah.
but not legally.
Yeah.
They go through third countries.
And you mentioned when we were talking about the banking that Iran has left a big chunk of money in Chinese banks for development projects? Or?
Yeah, well, I heard criticisms from some Iranians that the Chinese, while supposed to be friends of Iran, were taking advantage of the situation. I haven't interviewed the Chinese, so I can't verify one way or another on that. But objectively, what's happening is there was, I'm trying to remember the figure, $30 billion roughly of Iranian assets in China. And the Iranians need like dams and highways and big infrastructure projects. And the Chinese are going to come in, that money will be used, will stay in China, and China will deliver the people power and the engineers and the steel or whatever is needed for these infrastructure projects. That's my understanding.
I want to get to our studio audience for the conversation with them, but let me put out one question that I almost hesitate to bring up because it's almost too horrific to imagine. But let's just say that this time next year there's a Republican in the White House, and the Republicans have held
I'm going into paralysis.
Yeah, we've just gone to
because we know which Republican it's going to be. Sorry.
Maybe something will happen at the convention after all. Republicans in Congress and the person who's the nominal head of their party, who's running for president, have all sworn that the first thing they're going to do is just tear up this agreement. What would be the actual effect, do you think, of something like that happening?
Well, first of all, I think they would have that's what they're saying rhetorically now during the campaign. They'd actually have a hard time doing it because the Europeans have, the Chinese and the Russians, who are also part of this agreement, have resumed trade and are looking forward to doing more trade. And for the U.S. to unilaterally tear it up, why would the Europeans, the only reason the sanctions worked was because the Europeans had gone along with it.
Right.
So it'd be back to one more unilateral plan by the U.S. that wasn't working so well. So whoever gets elected, they may be nuts, but they're not crazy. They may, in other words,
we can only hope.
In other words, it won't be so easy to do it. But to answer your question directly, if they do tear it up, the U.S. will be very isolated internationally. They will try to impose the sanctions unilaterally, and there'll be a much, remember, all these sanctions were imposed unilaterally before 2010, and they really didn't have that much effect in Iran.
Right.
It's only when the Europeans and the banking sanctions and all that took effect that it really began to hurt. So I think we'll be back to that, and the U.S. will politically lose.
And Europe is not going to go back to doing it.
No, I don't think so. They may, the amount of investment they put into Iran is up for grabs, but for sure they're not going to go back to the old sanctions routine. Not assuming that Iran continues to carry out its end of the bargain, which they are so far.
Yeah, and we'll talk about more of that and more of the regional, but we'll get Crystal ready with the microphone, and if any of you in the audience have a question or comment, hold up your hand and wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone. And okay, down here, front row. And if you would stand up and make it easy on our camera people. And with this mic, you have to hold it right close by. Thanks.
Okay. Well, both Democrats and Republicans and Israel for years have been saying that Iran had a big nuclear program. And clearly our CIA and the Israeli intelligence knew what was going on. So why were we doing this if we knew that they didn't have a program?
Right. It's an excellent question.
Excellent question.
And the basic reason is that the U.S. needed some excuse to militarily threaten Iran. And at various times, the U.S., it's exactly the same thing as happened with the Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction. You search around for a reason that's going to get people really, really scared. So yes, Iran violates human rights. Yes, Iran supports groups like Hezbollah, which the U.S. claims are terrorists, but none of those issues grab at the throat of the American public like the idea of mad mullahs with nuclear weapons.
Right.
And oh my God, they're going to flatten Israel. That's enough to get you really worried. So that's the argument they settled on, in spite of the fact that the CIA, the NSA, and all of the U.S. intelligence agencies issued a formal statement saying Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program. And despite that, they just keep going on saying, oh, we've got to stop their nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, there was an intelligence assessment
Yes.
that was carried out by 19 intelligence agencies or something, and they all came to that.
Two of them, one under Bush and one under Obama.
Uh-huh.
And that's not even counting the IAEA, the UN agency that's in charge of this, that had people on the ground. And they said there was no nuclear weapons program anyway. Right. But it just shows you, partially it's the media coverage, partially it's the fact that both Democrats and Republicans voice similar positions on this question. Reality is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is the debate in Washington. And the debate in Washington was, invade them or cripple them with sanctions. That was the debate.
Yeah. That's often the debate.
Yes.
All options are on the table.
Yeah, exactly.
Both of them, yeah. It's a good question because, your answer is good. I'm looking at your book here, The Real Story of U.S. Policy in the Middle East Crisis. It came out in 2007. And just about everybody was convinced that Iran was next on the list. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if things hadn't gone so far south in Iraq, if it would have happened.
Well, yeah, sure, it's public record. This isn't some conspiracy theory. The Bush administration, after it invaded Iraq, actually there was some debate whether to invade Iraq or Iran first. There was some urging an immediate invasion of Iran. But they invaded Iraq, and then once the victory was proclaimed and Iraq had been transformed into a U.S.-sponsored paradise, then the next to fall would be Iran, and after that Syria and Lebanon, creating an entire new free enterprise-friendly, Israel-friendly, U.S.-dominated
military base.
Yeah, giant military base. Yeah, that was the plan.
Yeah.
Now it was harebrained to begin with, and of course it fell apart within very few months of the Iraq invasion because the Iraqi people wouldn't go along with it. Now, of course, the Iranian people wouldn't go along with it either, nor would anybody else. As we've seen in Syria, they ain't going along with it there. I mean, there is lots of things that are wrong in Iran. It's a repressive government. The people of Iran are not happy with their government, but they are even less happy with the idea that some outside power is going to come in and tell them what they should do. And we saw in 2009 when there were massive street demonstrations, that anger expressed itself. I'm convinced that the people of Iran, as the case of people throughout the Middle East, will, in their own time, in their own way, take care of their own government. They don't want the U.S. in there propping up a new Shah or some new dictator that's friendly to the U.S.
One lesson our leaders never seem to get. Okay, another audience question right down front here.
Well, actually, I'm going to follow up on this gentleman's question and ask you if you would say a little bit more about the real motives for this hallucinatory fear of Iran's nuclear program, and perhaps in relation to our supposed allies, the Saudis and other of the Gulf monarchies who have a rivalry with Iran. It really is hard for me to understand what I'd like to think are some intelligent people in our foreign policy establishment thought we were going to accomplish this way. So if you'd elaborate a little further, I'd appreciate it.
By the way, I agree with you. There are a lot of very intelligent people in Washington. I've had a chance to talk to State Department people and think tank people. It's not a problem of blundering incompetents who are unfamiliar with the language or they don't know the culture. Sometimes you hear that argument. That's not true. These are very, very sharp people. The problem is they're ideologically and politically out to lunch. You have to understand, if you're sitting in the State Department or the Pentagon for that matter, you're looking at what's called American strategic interests. Now, what are they? We are the world's superpower. We bring stability to the world. We need natural resources, for example, oil. We need strategic minerals. And in order to maintain, and we're a force for good in the world. We're the exception. We're all those other evil imperialist countries, but we are the exception because we fight for human rights and democracy. Now, in order to secure the energy resources that we need to do all these good things, who can we trust? Can we trust a Chinese oil company or a Russian oil company? Certainly not. We can only trust ExxonMobil, Texaco, maybe British Petroleum, BP, Shell, a select, mostly American oil companies, and a few Europeans thrown in because they're our allies, provided they're our allies at the moment. And once these oil companies and oil pipeline companies, et cetera, are operating in these countries, well, they certainly have a right to make profits, don't they? What do you expect them to work for free? So American national interests suddenly become the interests of making profits by these oil companies. And I cite oil companies as one example because you could do it for all kinds of other companies. Then, in order to make sure that our national interests of energy resources are protected, we must have friendly governments in power, because you do not want these oil companies nationalized or have their pipelines sliced up or rebel groups causing trouble. So you need a strong pro-US government with a strong military, which just happens to be trained and funded by the United States. And in order to get the oil from the oil fields to the West, well, you need pipelines and shipping. And in order to protect those shippings, you need naval bases. And you need military bases to protect the pipelines. And then you need some other military bases in other nearby countries because they neighbor the country with the big stuff and they might be unstable someday. So suddenly, pretty soon, you got 750 military bases around the world, all in our national interests, defensively protecting human rights and democracy around the world. I mean, it's pretty clear to me, isn't it to you? And that, in a nutshell, is the U.S. empire.
It's good to know that they have our best interests at heart. Okay, right here.
Hillary Clinton's been pretty belligerent towards Iran also, and as the election approaches, probably past the Democratic convention, I anticipate that there'll be some kind of a pivot for her to get the support of more of the neocons who have traditionally been in the Bush camp. Do you think there's much difference between what Trump and Clinton are likely to do, and what the likelihood of Clinton finding a way to back the deal down?
Well, an excellent question. Hillary Clinton is a hawk. Donald Trump is a hawk who keeps changing his position every 24 hours. I can't frankly tell what Trump stands for, except it's probably he's up to no good, based on the sum total of everything he said, including saying he would tear up the nuclear deal with Iran. Hillary Clinton favors the nuclear deal with Iran for the moment. And I think if she's elected, she will probably stick to that. But she will probably also crank up other kinds of pressure on Iran because, again, the issue is not whether Iran has a nuclear weapon or not, but Iran's power, regional power in the area. And for sure, Democrat or Republican elected is going to oppose that and crank up other kinds of pressure, whether it be military or additional sanctions or whatever, against Iran, while, in the case of Hillary, keeping the nuclear deal going. In a broader sense, it's very interesting. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was horrible, frankly. She did nothing to help pressure Israel to have a two-state solution with the Palestinians. She was a cheerleader and moving force for the war against Libya, which has turned Libya into a failed state. She was a big proponent of having a no-fly zone in Syria, which would have required the U.S. Military to go in and destroy the Syrian Air Force, and probably would have toppled Assad and brought to power chaos in Syria. But she's been a very strong advocate, a very hawkish position on most of those kind of issues related to the Middle East. Trump is driven by this kind of strange egomania that would be, at times more hawkish than Hillary Clinton and the Democratic hawks, and at times more isolationist. So it's hard to know. So he says he can talk with Putin. He can talk with Kim Jong-il in North Korea. What does that mean, to talk with him? What are you going to talk with him about? So I think what in practice will happen is that he will rely on traditional Republican advisors and cabinet members and State Department officials, et cetera, Pentagon officials, and we'll have as bad or worse a policy as we had under George Bush.
Okay, right here, and then hand the mic next to the gentleman next to you when you...
A two-part question. First one, as far as trade is concerned, I believe the
Hold it closer.
I believe the foreign subsidiaries of American companies can deal with Iran, and if Boeing makes a deal on selling airplanes, is there a specific exception for dealing in dollars with that? My second part of my question is, what do you think of this constant announcements that Iran is the greatest sponsor of terrorism?
Yeah.
I mean, even Cuba was sponsor of terrorism until last year.
Until it wasn't.
Yeah. No, those are good questions. There is an exception in the sanctions regimen for airplanes, actually. And what Boeing will have to do is, once they actually get down to a nuts and bolts agreement, is go to the OFAC, the Office of
Foreign Assets Control.
Foreign Assets Control, which is part of the American Treasury Department, and get a waiver that will allow them to deal in dollars for their planes. And your typical small or medium-sized American company can't work its way through the bureaucracy in OFAC. But somebody like Boeing, once it's got the go-ahead, they certainly have the resources to do that. So that's how that would work technically. Now, the second question was?
The greatest sponsor of terrorism.
We hear that a lot now. And this is the fallback plan now that the nuclear issue is off the table. Now this is the next thing that you should be really, really scared about. What does the U.S. claim? The U.S. says Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese political party and militia, which has defeated Israel in 2 wars and is currently fighting in Syria on the side of Assad, that they are a terrorist group. They claim the Iranians are supporting terrorist groups in Syria and in Iraq. But these are not like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. These are armed militias that favor Iran. I don't agree with Iran's policies in Syria, Lebanon, or in Iraq. They are arming people that they like with their right-wing agendas and political views and political Islam. But these are not terrorist groups. The terrorist groups in the region, the 2 largest, of course, are the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda affiliate in in Syria is al-Nusra. And as far as those things are concerned, Iran is fighting those folks. They're fighting them in Syria and they're fighting in Iraq. So the idea that Iran is somehow the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world is simply a lie to get people worried. A much bigger sponsor of terrorism in the world is Saudi Arabia. It's no secret. The Saudis fund madrasas, or schools that teach an extremely right-wing interpretation of Islam. They're funding the Nusra Front and other extremist groups in Syria. They launched a war in Yemen in which one of the byproducts is the growth of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen because the Saudis were cooperating with them in the fight against the people they didn't like, the Houthis. So you can make a case that Saudi Arabia is a far bigger and far more dangerous supporter of terrorism in the world, and real terrorism, groups like Al-Qaeda, but they're a U.S. ally. So they can't, by definition, they can't be supporting terrorism. It's an easy way out of that.
Since you mentioned Yemen briefly there, one of the things we hear a lot is the Iran-backed Houthis.
Yeah.
To what extent is that true? I know they've sent some support, but it doesn't seem like Iran is really that centrally involved in Yemen.
Okay, let's take it, because we've been tossing out a lot of names here, and people at home are going, what was that group again? All right, Yemen, along the southern border of Saudi Arabia, poorest country in the Middle East, and has gone through a lot of turmoil. During the Arab Spring, there was a big uprising. The U.S.-backed dictator was ousted, and his vice president came in, who was pretty much also pro-U.S., but ever since there's been a chaotic situation in Yemen. And there's a group called the Houthis. It's a political movement. It's a conservative political Islamist group. It's the kind of group that probably most of us in this room would not vote for if we heard their politics and had a chance to vote, if they happen to be holding elections. But they are an armed group that has significant support within Yemen, particularly in the northern part of the country. They captured the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and the Saudis decided they were going to invade. And they put together a coalition of other regional states in the area. They invaded and occupied Yemen. But after a year, it's been over a year now, they haven't gotten back to recapturing the capital. The vice president of the country, who's now the president, has no popular support. And what's happened is, like you see in Libya and and in Syria, the growth of militias, Al-Qaeda, and other groups who come into the vacuum because there's no central government anymore. So amongst this mishmash of various groups, yes, the Iranians give political support and limited military support to the Houthis. But the Houthis are an independent group that would, if Iran vanished tomorrow, would continue to have a certain amount of political support in Yemen, would find its own arms, would capture them from the Yemeni army or from the Saudis or whoever. So the idea that Saudi Arabia is fighting Iran in Yemen is simply a myth, is a justification to tell the world that it's okay to be fighting there. And as I said, one of the offshoots of this, you remember Al-Qaeda in Yemen was the people who sponsored the FedEx bomb that came on an airplane, the shoe bomber. I mean, these folks are real terrorists. They want to kill civilians with the intention of forcing their political views on people, as opposed to groups engaged in genuine armed struggle, which have a political program, which are fighting the military. Al-Qaeda is committed to killing civilians. And that group, which was the strongest Al-Qaeda faction in the world, has become even stronger as a direct result of the Saudi invasion, and which has been completely backed by the United States. Financed, backed, and politically supported, and now even air raids and troop involvement.
Yeah. We do have another question in the audience, so let's go there.
I'm going to go back to the nuclear issue. And as I remember it, the issue was not whether Iran had a nuclear program. I think there was, as you said, that they didn't currently have a nuclear program. But the issue was how long it would take them, if they decided to have a nuclear program, how long it would take them to build a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
And that was estimates of, I don't know, a year, or I don't remember what they were. But the purpose of the treaty was to keep that time frame greater than a certain amount. Is that correct? That there was general agreement, there was no current program, but it was the ability to start one which was at issue?
The so-called breakout time.
Yeah, that was indeed, you did a good summary of the argument in Washington and Tel Aviv as to what was going on and the justification. So, what's the reality? Interestingly enough, this guy Netanyahu, perhaps you've heard of him, the prime minister in Israel, he had been claiming that Iran was a matter of months, if not a few short years from having a nuclear weapon, going back 20 years. So the idea that there's some breakout point at which you can't stop Iran from having this nuclear weapon is simply a myth created by the US and Israel in particular to scare people. Because what's involved? Yes, there's a certain amount of time it might take to develop enriched plutonium from uranium. Enriched plutonium is used in weapons. Uranium enriched is used for nuclear power, and a certain low-grade plutonium. So Iran was on its way to kind of mastering the cycle of developing enriched plutonium. They were not completely, even going full speed ahead, they still had enough. There was a lot of disputes that they had enough plutonium even for one bomb. But that's only a very small part of it. How do you miniaturize it? How do you make it explode? How do you fit it on a missile so that it can be delivered? All of those are highly technical, not so easy problems to solve before you have an actual nuclear weapon. What's the proof of that? North Korea, which did leave the non-proliferation treaty, develop a nuclear weapon. To this day, it's not clear they've had a successful nuclear explosion based on US reports, and for sure they don't have missiles that can hit anything closer than a few miles away. And this has been 03, 04, roughly 10 years, over 10 years. So that gives you some idea, and they've been working at it nonstop with freezing everybody else out of the country. So the Iranians have this intrusive, cameras everywhere and personal, individual inspections, et cetera, et cetera. So there's very little, if any, chance that Iran could develop a nuclear weapon. And then the final thing is, even if they went into some kind of massive overdrive, what would they have? 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 nuclear missiles at the end of 10 or 20 years, compared to 200 in Israel, thousands in the United States. What are they going to do with 5 nuclear missiles, nuclear warheads? The people running Iran are angry, they're opposed to the US, they're opposed to Israel, but they're not crazy. If they launched a missile strike on Israel, for example, that would give the perfect excuse for Israel and the US to come in and destroy Iran. So 5 or 10 nuclear bombs are useless except as a deterrent to make another country think twice about coming in and invading you or attacking you, fearing that you would retaliate with nuclear weapons. That's the same mentality in North Korea as well. So on any level, technically, politically, militarily, the idea that Iran is at a breakout point or could reach a breakout point at which a nuclear bomb would mean something is just, it's a myth.
You just mentioned in the course of that the missiles and the missile technology, and I want to ask about possible stumbling block in this agreement in the future. We just saw this not too long ago, I think in the last couple of months, where Iran tested some new missile.
Yeah.
And you had a number of people in Washington affiliated with a certain political party saying, oh, it's a violation of the nuclear agreement. Could you straighten that out?
Right, the nuclear agreement deals with nuclear power and nuclear weapons, or the potential of developing. It has nothing to do with missiles.
Right.
It has nothing to do with troop strengths. It has nothing to do with how much money you spend on your defense budget. The US and the Soviet Union back in the day reached a nuclear arms reduction treaty, you may recall.
Yeah.
Did that stop the countries competing with each other all over the third world, or make Russia, the Soviet Union withdraw its troops from Eastern Europe? No. It was a limited agreement, which was a step forward because it made the potential use of nuclear weapons much less likely. That, looking back historically, made a lot of sense. It did not end all the other hostilities that existed. Well, this nuclear agreement with Iran is the same thing. So far, Iran has lived up to all aspects of what they agreed to do. The US has not. But in any case, it has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, with ballistic missiles, or with Iran sending troops to Iraq or Syria, or any of the other issues that we don't like them for.
We need to keep that in mind. Okay, one last question back. Let's go over here because we haven't had a woman for a while. Crystal?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll play the female card.
Okay. And we have 3 minutes left. so-
Okay, just really briefly, assuming that you are very supportive of the nuclear agreement, what other steps would you like to see the United States take to try to normalize relations with Iran? Do you think that's possible in our lifetime?
Well,
That's
that's
perfect. That was my last question. Where do we go from here?
Lift the sanctions, the existing sanctions against Iran would be a big step forward. Resume normal trade. Now, that doesn't mean stopping diplomatic and political pressure for when Iran does bad things. Yeah, I have no problem with continuing that. But generally look at what we're doing with Cuba. As the gentleman pointed out before, Cuba somehow is sponsoring terrorism, another phony charge. The U.S. has normalized relations with Cuba. Things are not perfect, but it's going in the right direction. We could do that with Iran as well.
Is that possible?
Is that possible? Well, doubtful. It is certainly possible to do. But given that there's going to be Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump coming into office, and it's unclear what the Senate and the House are going to look like, you've got to clear out an awful lot of right-wing Democrats and Republicans out of the two houses before you could try and see something like that. So if I had to make a prediction and hope that the hostility would lessen, but it's not going to go away.
In a way, I guess the hopeful thing about this agreement is that after 40 years of total diplomatic estrangement, this was really the first time that high-level diplomats from the two countries sat in the same room. 40 years and numerous presidents. So it started something in the right direction.
It did, and taking that issue off the table is an important one.
Yeah.
That is important politically, because people can't claim, oh, Iran is going to destroy Israel with nuclear weapons, or is going to blow up the United States with nuclear weapons, and that's a step forward.
Or we'll have a deterrent against a U.S. invasion.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Any plans to go back there, maybe next year for the presidential election?
I hope to go back and continue my coverage not only from Iran, but from the whole region.
Okay. Well, this has been Other Voices, and this has been REESE ERLICH, award-winning journalist, recipient of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting grant for his Iran coverage, author of The Iran Agenda. And we're here every month, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Next month is set. You may have heard of corporate personhood. Have you ever heard of corporate nationhood? If you haven't, you need to be here next month. Thanks for watching. Thank you in the audience for coming. REESE, thank you very much. Thank you.